students, welcome to third lecture on Class 10 History, Chapter 2, Nationalism in India. So in the previous lecture, we learned that the non-cooperation movement was withdrawn by Gandhiji in 1922 after the Chauri Chaura incident. In this video, let's see the aftermath of non-cooperation movement and what happened after the non-cooperation movement ended. Within the Congress, many leaders were tired of mass struggle and wanted to participate in the provincial council elections in order to bring reforms. C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru formed a Swaraj party within the Congress for this. So some leaders formed a separate party from the Congress called the Swaraj party. Other leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose wanted radical mass agitation. So in the 1920s, there were two different viewpoints of the leaders. Few leaders wanted Swaraj party formation and wanted to participate in the elections conducted by the British government, while other leaders, the radical leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose, wanted mass agitation in order to get full independence. So in the late 1920s, two factors shaped Indian politics. The first was worldwide economic depression and the second was the Sanyam Commission. So let's study about them in detail. First, the Great Economic Depression. So agricultural prices began to fall. The demand for agricultural goods fell and agricultural exports declined. The peasants found it very difficult to sell harvest and pay revenue. By 1930, the countryside was in turmoil. Second, the Sanyam Commission. So the British government sent a Sanyam Commission under Sir John Simon to look into the functioning of constitutional system in India and suggest few changes. But the problem was that all the members of the Sanyam Commission were British and it did not have single Indian member. Hence, when the Sanyam Commission arrived in India in 1928, the Indians opposed it. People participated in demonstrations with Simon Go Back slogans. The Viceroy, Lord Irwin, arranged a round-table conference to discuss future constitution. But still, the Congress leaders were not satisfied. In December 1929, under the presidency of Jawaharlal Nehru, the Lahore Congress declared Purna Swaraj, that means full independence. And 26th January was to be celebrated as Independence Day. But this issue got very little attention. After the failure of Purna Swaraj movement, Mahatma Gandhi decided to relate the idea of freedom to more everyday issues. And for this, he selected the issue of salt tax. He found that salt was a very powerful symbol that could unite the country. This was because salt was eaten by everyone, including the rich and poor. The tax on salt by the government monopoly of the salt production was the most oppressive phase of British rule. Hence, he decided to take up this issue and fight against it. So, on 31st January 1930, Gandhiji sent a letter to Viceroy Irwin. This letter had 11 demands. It included the demand of abolition of salt tax. If the demands were not fulfilled, then the Congress would start a civil disobedience movement. But Lord Irwin was unwilling to negotiate and he did not fulfill the demands. Hence, Gandhiji started the famous Salt March along with 78 of his followers. This march is known as the Dandi March. The route of this Salt March was from Sabarmati Ashram to the coastal town of Dandi, covering 240 miles. The volunteers walked for 24 days, covering 10 miles per day. On April 6th, Gandhiji and his followers reached Dandi and violated the law manufacturing salt from the seawater. This marked the beginning of civil disobedience movement. So let's learn more about the civil disobedience movement. Now let's see how was this civil disobedience movement different from the non-cooperation movement. So in the non-cooperation movement, it said that don't cooperate with British. But the civil disobedience movement said that not only refuse cooperation but also break the colonial laws. So let's see how this civil disobedience movement took place. So thousands of people broke the salt law, foreign clothes was boycotted, and liquor shops were picketed. The peasants refused to pay revenue and the chowkidari tax. The forest people violated forest laws and went into the reserved forests, which were earlier they were forbidden to do so. Now let's see, when the civil disobedience movement was taking place, then what was the reaction of government? So the government began arresting Congress leaders. Gandhiji was also arrested. And when this happened, industrial workers in Sholapur attacked the government buildings in order to protest. Third, peaceful satyagrahis were attacked. Women and children were beaten and 1 lakh people were arrested. So, seeing all this violence, Gandhiji decided to call off the civil disobedience movement by the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. So, let's see what was this Gandhi-Irwin Pact. So, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact was signed on 5th March 1931. Irwin's demand was that Gandhiji should attend the second roundtable conference in London, while Gandhiji's demand was to release all the political prisoners. The result was that Gandhiji went to London but returned disappointed. When he returned, he found that the leaders had not been released and the Congress had been declared illegal. So, Irwin's promise was to release all the leaders, but he did not keep his promise, and that's why Gandhiji relaunched this civil disobedience movement but in 1934 it lost its momentum. So let's see which all groups participated in the civil disobedience movement. Several groups participated in the movement for the specific objectives. And these groups were the rich peasants, poor peasants, business class, industrial class, and women. So let's study about each one of them in detail. First, rich peasants, which included the Patidars of Gujarat and the Jats of Uttar Pradesh. So being producers of commercial crops, they were hit hard by the trade depression. As their income disappeared, they found it impossible to pay the government revenue. They became enthusiastic supporters of the civil disobedience movement and participated in the various boycott programs. For them, fight for Swaraj was against high revenue. They were deeply disappointed when the CDM movement was called off without the revenue rates being revised. So they had participated in the civil disobedience movement so that the revenue rates could be revised. But this did not happen. Hence, they refused to participate in the civil disobedience movement too. Second, now let's talk about the poor peasants. So these poor peasants rented the land from landlords and then cultivated that land. So they did not have any land of their own. They had to rent the land from some landlords and then cultivate the land. As the depression continued, they found it very difficult to pay the rent. Their demands were that the landlords should cancel the unpaid rent. For this, they tried to support the civil disobedience movement. But the Congress did not support these peasants, as it felt that this might upset the landlords who funded the Congress's movement. Third, business class. So they reacted against the colonial policies that restricted business activities. Their demands were that they wanted protection against the import of foreign goods, and their leaders were Purushottam Das Thakur Das and Ghanshyam Das Birla. So they formed the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920 and formed the FICCI, that is Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industries, in 1921 in order to carry out their struggle. At first, they gave support to the civil disobedience movement and refused to buy and sell imported goods. After the failure of the Roundtable Conference, they lost enthusiasm and they did not participate in the civil disobedience movement when it was launched again in 1934. The meaning of Swaraj for them was that when colonial restriction on business would no longer exist. Fourth, industrial working class. They did not participate in the civil disobedience movement in large numbers except in the Nagpur region. So in Nagpur, industrial people participated in large numbers, but in the rest of India, they did not participate. They adopted few ideas of the Gandhian program like boycott of foreign goods. Their demand was that a movement should be launched against low wages and poor working conditions. But the Congress did not support them, as again this would upset the industrialists who gave funds to the Congress. So in this way, the Congress did not support this industrial working class, hence they did not participate in the civil disobedience movement in large numbers. Fifth, women. So one important feature of the civil disobedience movement was the large-scale participation of women. During the Dandi March, thousands of women supported Gandhiji. They participated in protest marches, manufactured salt, and picketed foreign cloth and liquor shops. And for this, they also went to jail. But the problem was that the Congress was reluctant to allow women to hold any authoritative position. And Gandhiji felt that the role of women was as a housewife and they should not participate in the freedom movement. And they were just like a symbol. Now let's talk about the limitations or the problems of the civil disobedience movement. So not all groups were moved by the concept of Swaraj, and many groups did not participate in the civil disobedience movement. These were the Dalits and the Muslims. So let's talk about them in detail. First, let's talk about the Untouchables or the Dalits. So the Congress ignored the Dalits for fear of offending the high caste Hindus. But Mahatma Gandhi was against untouchability. He organized a satyagraha to ensure the entry of Dalits to temples, roads, schools and public wells. But many Dalit leaders were keen on a different solution to this problem. They began organizing themselves, demanding reserved seats in educational institutions and demanding a separate electorate for the Dalit members. One such Dalit leader was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. He clashed with Gandhiji at the second round of Round Table Conference. He demanded separate electorate for Dalits. The British agreed to his demand, but Gandhiji did not agree to his demand, and he felt that this would disunite the nation. Hence, he began to fast to death. To prevent this, the Pune Pact was signed. Ultimately, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar accepted Gandhiji's position and Pune Pact was signed in September 1932. It gave the depressed classes reserved seats in provincial and central legislative councils, but they were to be voted by the general electorate. So though the Dalits got reserved seats, but still they did not get a separate electorate. They still were voted by all the normal people. However, Dalit participation in the civil disobedience movement continued to be very limited. And the second group which did not support the civil disobedience movement were the Muslim organizations. From the mid-1920s, the Congress was more visible as a Hindu-dominated party, and they started to be associated with Hindu organizations like the Hindu Mahasabha. And Muslims started feeling very alienated after the decline of non-cooperation Khilafat movement. There were Hindu-Muslim communal clashes and riots in many cities. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of Muslim League, demanded reserved seats in the Central Assembly. Muslim leaders feared that culture and identity of Muslims would be submerged under the dominance of Hindu majority. Hence, large sections of Muslims did not respond to the civil disobedience movement. So this was all for today. I hope that you were able to understand the civil disobedience movement in detail. In the next lecture, we shall discuss the sense of collective belonging among Indians. Thank you.